They were shot, shelved, and forgotten. War stories buried by governments, lost reels, or simple neglect. But decades later, they resurfaced like ghosts from the 20th century, revealing what the world was never meant to see. From propaganda gone wrong to anti-war masterpieces banned in their own countries, these are the 15 lost war movies from the 20th century that resurfaced. Number 15, The Bridge, 1959. When Bernhard Wicki's The Bridge premiered in post-war Germany, it shocked a nation still licking its wounds. This wasn't a patriotic war film. It was a mirror. The movie followed 7 teenage boys drafted to defend a meaningless bridge during the final days of World War II. No heroes, no glory, just confusion, loyalty, and death. Initially, German audiences weren't ready. The government didn't want reminders that young boys were sacrificed for propaganda. Critics called it unpatriotic. The U.S. Army, which still influenced West German media, allegedly discouraged broadcasters from airing it. Within years, prints went missing from archives. Rumors circulated that it had been intentionally destroyed. But in the late 1980s, a forgotten copy surfaced in a Bavarian studio vault. Restored and re-released, it was hailed as one of the greatest anti-war films ever made. The haunting realism, the mud, the fear, the feudal orders, spoke to a generation that had lived through it. Today, The Bridge stands as Germany's paths of glory, a painful confession the world nearly lost to silence. It's proof that the most powerful war stories aren't about victory, but the innocents left bleeding behind. Number 14, The Steel Helmet, 1951. Before Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket, there was The Steel Helmet. Directed by Samuel Fuller, a real-life World War II veteran, it was one of the first films about the Korean War, but its gritty tone and scathing realism made it a target. Shot in just 10 days on a shoestring budget, the movie depicted American soldiers as flawed, racist, and traumatized men, an unthinkable portrayal in an era obsessed with heroism. The Army branded Fuller un-American. FBI agents visited his studio, and theaters were warned not to book the film. Some prints disappeared, others were edited to remove politically dangerous lines. For decades, it was missing from TV circulation. Scholars whispered that the Pentagon itself had buried it. Then, in the late 1990s, a pristine copy was found in the UCLA archive during a restoration project. When re-released, critics were stunned by its modern tone, its cynical humor, its psychological depth, its refusal to glorify war. Fuller later said, "I didn't make a war movie. I made a movie about soldiers." That distinction, once too bold for the censors, is what makes The Steel Helmet one of cinema's earliest and most brutally honest portraits of the soldier's mind. Number 13, The Burmese Harp, 1956. At first glance, The Burmese Harp looked like a gentle post-war melodrama, but beneath its serene surface lay Japan's deepest cinematic wound. Kon Ichikawa's film followed a Japanese soldier in Burma who, after the war's end, refuses to return home. Haunted by guilt and the bodies of the fallen, he becomes a wandering monk, playing a harp as he buries the dead. The film's haunting beauty and pacifist message were seen as dangerous in Cold War Japan, where military pride was quietly returning. Right-wing groups threatened theaters, calling the film defeatist. Distribution halted after a few months, and Ichikawa's negatives reportedly vanished when the studio merged in the 1960s. For years, The Burmese Harp was believed lost, surviving only in rumors and secondhand recollections. In 1982, a 16mm print was discovered in a Tokyo University archive, miraculously intact. Its re-release stunned audiences. Critics called it a Buddhist requiem for a century of blood. Ichikawa's quiet masterpiece had outlasted the censorship, the politics, and the fear. Today it stands as one of the most spiritual anti-war statements ever filmed, reminding us that sometimes silence and mourning say more than 1,000 gunshots. Number 12, King and Country, 1964. When King and Country premiered, audiences weren't ready for its quiet fury. Directed by Joseph Losey, an American exile blacklisted during the McCarthy era, the film was set during World War I, but spoke to the disillusionment of the Vietnam generation. The story follows a British private, Arthur Hamp, charged with desertion after walking away from the front. His defense lawyer, played by Dirk Bogarde, slowly realizes the truth. Hamp isn't a coward. He's a shattered man. The trenches have broken him. The film's climax, an execution by firing squad, was so coldly realistic that early test screenings left the viewers in stunned silence. British censors hated it. The War Office refused to cooperate. Lucy was accused of defaming the armed forces and was unofficially blacklisted from several UK studios. Even television stations refused to air it, fearing complaints from veterans groups. Within a few years, the film virtually disappeared from circulation, with only low-quality prints circulating in Eastern Europe. Then, decades later, a restored version emerged at the Venice Film Festival. Critics hailed it as a forgotten masterpiece, an anti-war courtroom drama that dared to ask, who kills the soldiers who refuse to die for nothing? Bogard called it the proudest work of his career. Today, King and Country feels eerily timeless. Its claustrophobic sets, echoing gunshots, and raw performances expose the psychological cost of war with surgical precision. A movie once silenced for being too painful now speaks louder than ever, reminding us that the enemy isn't always across the battlefield. Number 11. The Ascent, 1977. Larisa Shepitko's. The Ascent was so haunting that the Soviet Union itself tried to bury it. Shot in the frozen Belarusian wilderness, it told the story of two partisans captured by Nazis, one choosing faith, the other survival. It's a stark meditation on betrayal, guilt, and redemption that feels more like scripture than cinema. Upon completion, Soviet censors panicked. The film's Christian symbolism, despairing tone, and critique of moral compromise were seen as subversive. Rumors spread that the KGB intervened directly. Prints were confiscated, screenings halted, and Shepitko was ordered to revise her message. She refused. For years, The Ascent was confined to vaults, screened only in select state-approved venues. Tragically, Shepitko died 2 years later in a car crash while preparing her next film. Her death sealed The Ascent's disappearance. For decades, it survived only through whispers, until an archive 35mm negative was rediscovered in the 90s by film historians. When restored, it stunned the world. Its visuals, snowblind landscapes, hollow eyes, the silent dignity of suffering, were unlike anything else in Soviet cinema. Critics compared it to Dreyer's Passion of Joan of Arc. It won the Golden Bear posthumously, decades late. Today, The Ascent stands as both an artistic resurrection and a spiritual experience. A lost Soviet film that transcended its regime, it asks one eternal question. When the world forces you to betray everything, how do you keep your soul intact? Number 10. Hell in the Pacific, 1968. 2 men, 2 enemies, 1 island. That's the entire setup for Hell in the Pacific. A minimalist masterpiece directed by John Boorman and starring 2 acting titans, Lee Marvin and Toshiro Mifune. When it was released, critics didn't know what to make of it. A World War II story without dialogue, without sides, and without victory. Audiences expecting a traditional war movie were bewildered. The film's raw depiction of survival, an American pilot and a Japanese soldier stranded together, was too strange, too philosophical. Studio executives panicked. They demanded a new ending where both men died in a sudden explosion, hoping to make it more commercial. Boorman despised the change. His original cut, where the soldiers learned to cooperate and face the absurdity of war, was shelved. The altered version flopped, and soon the film was forgotten, its deeper message lost under the rubble of studio interference. Decades later, the director's original ending was found in a Japanese archive and restored for a Blu-ray release. The restored cut revealed the film's true intention, a fable about reconciliation between enemies who discover their shared humanity only after everything else is stripped away. Today, Hell in the Pacific feels prophetic. Long before Hollywood embraced anti-war realism, Boorman had already dismantled the myth of the enemy. The movie's silence, its isolation, its final act of tragic irony, all remind us that war doesn't end when the shooting stops. It ends when men finally learn to see each other as human. Number 9. Come and See, 1985. Few films have captured the sheer madness of war like Elim Klimov's Come and See. But what most people don't realize is that this Soviet masterpiece nearly vanished before it ever reached the screen. Filmed in the swamps of Belarus with real weapons, live ammunition, and unflinching realism, Come and See followed a young boy's descent into the nightmare of the Nazi occupation. It wasn't a movie. It was an exorcism. The cinematography burned images of horror into viewers' minds. Villages ablaze, children shot, humanity erased. Soviet censors were horrified. "This film will damage morale," one official wrote. Klimov was told to cut nearly half the footage and remove the hysteria. He refused. For months, the film was locked away in government storage, nearly canceled by the State Committee for Cinematography. Then, in a miraculous turn, it was quietly released with minimal publicity. But its distribution was sabotaged, limited prints, pulled screenings, vanishing schedules. For years it circulated underground, shared among film students on smuggled VHS tapes. When Western critics finally saw it after the fall of the Soviet Union, Come and See was hailed as one of the greatest war films ever made. The New York Times called it the most powerful anti-war statement in film history. Restored in 4K decades later, it's now recognized not as Soviet propaganda, but as pure human tragedy. Today, Come and See remains unbearable to watch, yet impossible to forget. It was lost to fear, buried by bureaucracy, but it resurfaced to remind the world that war isn't heroic. It's insanity itself, and Klimov dared to look straight into its screaming face. Number 8. Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, 1983. Before The Last Emperor or The Thin Red Line, there was Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, a haunting meditation on captivity, culture, and guilt. Directed by Nagisa Oshima and starring David Bowie and Ryuichi Sakamoto, the film told the story of a British POW and his conflicted relationship with his Japanese captor in a World War II prison camp. Critics were mesmerized by its ambiguity and emotional depth, but in Japan, it stirred a storm. Right-wing groups condemned it for dishonoring Japanese officers. The film's pacifist message and depiction of moral complexity ran against the government's narrative of post-war dignity. In some countries, distributors refused to screen it at all, citing cultural sensitivity. Even stranger, the master print mysteriously disappeared after its limited European release. For nearly 20 years, fans and archivists believed it lost, until a 35mm reel surfaced in the Netherlands in the early 2000s. Painstakingly restored, it was reintroduced to festivals, earning new acclaim as a cinematic poem about forgiveness and shame. Behind the camera, Bowie gave one of his most restrained, soulful performances. Sakamoto's score, icy, tragic, and unforgettable, became one of the most recognized war themes in cinema history. The movie had transcended its controversy, becoming something deeper, a requiem for two nations caught between cruelty and compassion. Today, Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence stands as proof that reconciliation is the hardest battle of all. It was a film the world tried to forget, but the music, the faces, the silence, they wouldn't let it die. Number 7. Paths of Glory, 1957. Long before Dr. Strangelove made Stanley Kubrick a household name, Paths of Glory nearly destroyed his career. Shot in stark black and white, the film followed French soldiers court-martialed for cowardice after refusing to charge into certain death. It was uncompromising, furious, poetic, and devastatingly real. French authorities were outraged. The army declared it anti-patriotic. Veterans groups demanded it be banned, calling it an insult to the honor of France. The French government quietly pressured NATO allies not to screen it on military bases. Even Switzerland and Belgium refused theatrical runs out of diplomatic respect. Kubrick's wife later revealed that he received anonymous death threats. Cinemas were vandalized. The film was pulled from circulation in France for nearly 2 decades, surviving only in imported American reels. For years, it was whispered about but rarely seen, its reputation growing in the shadows. When it finally resurfaced in 1975, critics hailed it as a masterpiece. Kirk Douglas's impassioned performance as Colonel Dax, defending soldiers condemned by their own generals, became legendary. Kubrick's camera work, cold, symmetrical, merciless, turned trench warfare into a study of human corruption. Today, Paths of Glory is not just a film, but a moral document. Its message, of courage destroyed by bureaucracy and pride, echoes through every war that followed. Once banned for defeatism, it now stands as one of cinema's most enduring acts of defiance. It reminds us that truth, no matter how deeply buried, always resurfaces. Number 6. Overlord, 1975. When Stuart Cooper's Overlord premiered, few noticed. It was a small British production blending fiction with real wartime footage, but what it achieved was nothing short of revolutionary, a ghostly fusion of documentary realism and tragic prophecy. The film follows a young British soldier, Tom, from his induction into the army to his inevitable death on D-Day. There's no glorification, no heroics, only quiet dread and the slow realization that he's marching toward oblivion. Cooper used actual archival footage from the Imperial War Museum, intercut with his black and white dramatization, creating an eerie sense that past and present were collapsing into each other. Yet, that brilliance became its curse. The Ministry of Defense objected to Cooper's use of real D-Day footage without context, claiming it could undermine national morale. The film was pulled from many theaters after a brief limited release, and its distribution halted entirely when the rights became entangled in legal disputes between the museum and producers. For years, Overlord vanished. Even film students couldn't find a copy. Then, in the early 2000s, the British Film Institute restored it from the original negative, unveiling a stunning rediscovery. Critics who finally saw it called it a time capsule of doomed innocence. Kubrick himself, who viewed the film privately, reportedly admired its realism, saying it captured the poetry of inevitability. Today, Overlord is hailed as one of the most haunting anti-war films ever made, an elegy for youth swallowed by history. Once lost to bureaucracy and indifference, it now stands as a cinematic resurrection. Number 5. The Red and the White, 1967. Miklos Yanchos. The Red and the White is less a war film than a fever dream of chaos and betrayal. Set during the Russian Civil War, it showed soldiers of both sides, Reds and Whites, trapped in a cycle of brutality so senseless it borders on surrealism. Shot in long, fluid takes across the barren Hungarian plains, the film stripped war of its heroes, logic, and victory. Janso's camera wandered without attachment, observing men reduced to mere pawns. But when the film was released, the Soviet authorities were outraged. It was meant to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the revolution. Instead, it exposed its cruelty. Censors immediately withdrew it, calling it politically irresponsible. Soviet distributors banned it from export, and Hungarian officials ordered theaters to destroy reels. Janso's name quietly disappeared from state film programs. For years, the film existed only in fragmented form, hidden in private archives. Then, in the 1990s, a full 35mm print was discovered in a mislabeled canister in Budapest's National Film Archive. When restored and shown internationally, it was hailed as a lost masterpiece, a meditation on war as theater, where ideology itself becomes meaningless. Its hypnotic visuals and emotional detachment influenced directors from Tarkovsky to Scorsese. Once condemned as dangerous, The Red and the White now stands as one of the most profound anti-war allegories ever filmed. Proof that truth can survive even when every system conspires to erase it. Number 4. Fires on the Plain, 1959. Few war films are as brutally honest or as horrifying as Kon Ichikawa's Fires on the Plain. Set in the Philippines during Japan's final defeat in World War II, it follows a starving soldier wandering through a landscape of corpses, madness, and moral decay. It's not just about war. It's about what happens after the soul collapses. Upon its release, Japanese critics were appalled. The film showed their soldiers not as noble warriors, but as cannibalistic survivors clawing through mud and despair. The Japanese military denounced it for disgracing the army's honor. Theaters faced bomb threats from nationalist groups, and government broadcasters refused to air it for nearly 20 years. Internationally, it was lauded by critics but rarely seen. Distributors feared its bleakness would alienate audiences. Then, after decades of obscurity, a restored print premiered at the Tokyo Film Festival in 1988. Younger audiences, unshackled from post-war shame, hailed it as a masterpiece of moral confrontation. Ichikawa later revealed that the film's suppressed distribution was unofficially encouraged by the Japanese Ministry of Culture. They feared foreign audiences would view Japan as barbaric, but time has turned that fear into reverence. Today, Fires on the Plain is considered one of the greatest anti-war films ever made. Its stark cinematography and nihilistic honesty influencing generations of filmmakers. Once buried for showing what no one wanted to see, it now burns like a warning that the real hell of war isn't in the flames, but in the hearts of men. Number 3. The Hill, 1965. When The Hill hit theaters, it was too raw, too unflinching, and too truthful for comfort. Directed by Sidney Lumet and starring Sean Connery, fresh off his superstardom as James Bond, it tore away the glamour of military discipline and exposed the cruelty lurking beneath it. Set in a British military prison during World War II, The Hill followed a group of soldiers punished for minor offenses. Their torment came in the form of endless climbs up a man-made sand hill in the desert heat, under the sadistic command of a power-drunk sergeant. What begins as discipline turns into psychological torture, a metaphor for the dehumanization of war itself. Upon release, the British Army tried to distance itself from the film. Military officials called it demoralizing and demanded that screenings for troops be canceled. Some countries banned it outright, arguing it portrayed Allied soldiers as villains. Even Connery's own studio hesitated to promote it, fearing backlash from his Bond fanbase. For decades, The Hill faded from mainstream memory, but when a restored print resurfaced in the early 2000s, it was hailed as one of Lumet's greatest works. Critics finally recognized it for what it was, a psychological masterpiece about authority, obedience, and moral collapse. Connery called it the best performance of his life, and for good reason. His portrayal of a man crushed between conscience and command turned him from movie idol to serious actor. Today, The Hill stands as a forgotten mirror of the 20th century's ugliest truth. Sometimes the worst battles aren't fought between nations, but within institutions built to protect them. Once suppressed for daring to show that, it now towers as one of cinema's boldest anti-establishment war dramas. Number 2. The Big Parade, 1925. Before All Quiet on the Western Front, there was The Big Parade, a silent-era phenomenon that vanished for nearly half a century. Directed by King Vidor, it told the story of a spoiled American who enlists in World War I and is transformed by the brutality of the front. It was both an epic and an intimate tragedy, a film decades ahead of its time. Upon release, it became the highest-grossing movie of the 1920s, praised for its realism and emotional power. But when MGM was sold in the 1950s, the nitrate negatives were misplaced, then presumed destroyed in a vault fire. For decades, the film survived only in fragments shown at art houses and museums. Whispers of a complete print persisted, but no one could confirm it until the 1980s, when a film historian uncovered a nearly pristine copy in a Czech archive. The restoration took years, but when it finally screened again, audiences were stunned. What they saw wasn't just an old war movie, it was the birth of modern war cinema. The battle sequences, men crawling through mud, soldiers trembling under bombardment, felt more documentary than fiction. Its tenderness, especially in a tragic love story between a soldier and a French farm girl, brought silent audiences to tears. Today, The Big Parade stands as one of the great rediscoveries in cinema history. Once thought lost to fire, it has risen from the ashes, a reminder that even a century later, humanity's earliest cinematic warning about war still speaks louder than ever. Number 1. All Quiet on the Western Front, 1930. It was the film that defined the century, and the one the world tried hardest to bury. Lewis Milestone's All Quiet on the Western Front was released only 12 years after World War I ended, and it dared to tell the story from the German side. Audiences expecting patriotic valor were met with horror, mud, blood, and despair. The soldiers weren't monsters. They were boys trapped in a slaughterhouse. The film's realism was revolutionary: trench explosions, lifeless eyes, and a silent, devastating finale. But that honesty came at a price. In Germany, Nazi gangs stormed theaters, releasing rats into screenings to scare audiences away. Joseph Goebbels personally condemned it as degenerate pacifism. The film was banned, prints were burned, and possession of a copy could lead to arrest. Other nations followed. Italy, Austria, and even some American towns restricted it for being too demoralizing. For decades, the film survived only through scattered reels and censored re-edits. Then, in the 1970s, archivists pieced together a near-complete version from international copies. Its restoration revealed the film's raw power and its eerie relevance. Today, All Quiet on the Western Front is more than a movie. It's a moral reckoning. It exposes the cost of propaganda, the fragility of innocence, and the futility of glory. Once banned by fascists, now studied as a warning to all nations. It's the war film that refused to die. They tried to bury these films under censorship, politics, or fear. But truth has a way of clawing back to the light. Each one captured the human cost of war so honestly that the world turned away. But now, we can look again. Which of these lost masterpieces moved you most? Like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below, before history forgets again.